We welcome you to another Sunday School lesson. Sunday School is a gift from God. In Matthew chapter 10 Jesus says, "Go." The disciples go. Jesus means business. He's the Lord. We do what he says. This lesson may appear to be for the first disciples. There are elements in this short-term mission trip that are universal, and elements that are not. There are time-based elements that we will see, like when he tells the disciples to not share the gospel with Gentiles and Samaritans, but only the Jews. This was the first short-term mission trip, but there is a lot for us to learn. Verse 1a says, Jesus called his 12 disciples to him. As he traveled around Galilee, Jesus spoke about the need for more workers. Jesus recruited some men for the mission. These are 12 very ordinary men. None of them have wealth, degrees, social position. They are the team that Jesus picked after much prayer. These disciples were chosen not for what they were, but for what they were capable of becoming, under Christ's influence and in his power. Jesus has been in prayer for Israel, because they are like sheep without a shepherd. These 12 disciples are symbolic for the 12 tribes of Israel. They are to provide the leadership that Israel needed, but didn't have. Verse 1b says, "And gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness." He called them and gave them authority over unclean spirits and over every disease and affliction. Ordinary people, but extraordinary authority. Verse 2a says, "These are the names of the 12 apostles." Here the 12 are called apostles for the first time in Matthew. The word means one sent on a mission, who represents and shares the authority of the one who sends. It is also noteworthy that the 12 are called disciples in verse 1 and apostles in verse 2. This is probably to highlight that we must first be learners before we become teachers, first taught of God, before being sent of God. Discipleship is lifelong, and not a mere 3-week instructional program. Verse 2b says, "First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James son of Zebedee, and his brother John." Peter is listed first, as he is in every list in the Bible. He was most certainly the first among equals. Together with Andrew, his brother, they are fishermen. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, were also fishermen. Both James and John, along with Peter, witnessed Jesus' transfiguration. Verse 3a says, "Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector." Not much is written about these four, but Matthew had to be the least popular. This guy was a tax collector and was considered a traitor. Verse 3b and 4 says, "James son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him." Zealots were extreme patriots. Simon is the exact opposite of Matthew, who sold his soul to the Romans to make money. Zealots were trained and prepared to assassinate for the sake of Israel. They were extremists. They were like religious Navy SEALs. Had Simon met Matthew in a back alley, he probably would have stabbed him. Judas betrayed Jesus. He is always last in all the lists in the Gospels. Both the first in the list and the last on the list betrayed Jesus. Only one repented. Verses 5 and 6 says, "These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions: Do not go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Go rather to the lost sheep of Israel." When Jesus instructed the 12, his orders has important significance. These bears the idea of a military command. Obedience is not an option. The instructions implies the continuing nature of these commands. Jesus now tells them where to go, and where not to. Their mission is restricted to the lost house of Israel. At first sight, limiting the mission to Israel appears to contradict with the Great Commission, where the command extends to all nations and all people. There is no contradiction. As Jesus soon says, there is an anticipation of the disciples going into Gentile territory. Here it is a matter of strategy and priority. God's plan was to reach the whole world, but beginning with Israel. There was certainly enough work to do among the lost sheep of the house of Israel to keep the 12 busy until God directly commanded them to expand their ministry. They have a clear, limited objective. Verse 7 says, "As you go, proclaim this message, the kingdom of heaven has come near." Having identified the people to be reached by the mission, Jesus now clearly spells out the mission's purpose. The fundamental objective of the mission is to proclaim the dawning of the kingdom of heaven. The disciples were not to go to entertain, they were to proclaim the nearness of the kingdom. The disciples both had a message to preach and a power to display. In this, they were truly followers of their master. They must go in confidence, expecting God to work. They are to go to the lost, the distressed and the poor. Often the poor, the needy, and the marginalized respond most readily to the good news, while the affluent isolate themselves. Verse 8 says, "Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received, freely give." The command to proclaim the nearness of the kingdom is followed by 4 imperatives. Healing of the sick, raising of the dead, cleansing of lepers, and casting out demons are part of the good news of the kingdom. Indeed, it is that which they exemplify and symbolize. There is no indication that these miracles have ceased with the first disciples. No scriptural warrant exists to suggest that this authority has been permanently withdrawn. It is wise for Christians today to both believe in God's power to do such miracles through His people, while remaining careful and not too quick to believe unsubstantiated reports of such miracles. The blessings of discipleship come solely by grace and as such must be similarly imparted. Jesus charged His disciples nothing, and He expected them to minister unto others without charge. This is the foundational principle for the commands that follow. Disciples were to be dependent on God, not on their own wealth or possessions, for necessities. There is to be no charge for the proclamation or the accompanying healings. As the disciples received freely, so they are to give freely. Verse 9-10 say, "Do not get any gold or silver or copper to take with you in your belts, no bag for the journey or extra shirt or sandals or a staff." Accordingly, they are not to take with them money, silver, gold, or brass, for their belts or even bother with the ordinary things a traveler takes along, a knapsack, an extra shirt, a pair of sandals, or a staff. They are to be totally committed to the cause and its urgency, and in that total, unrestricted commitment to rely exclusively on the provision the Lord will make through those who receive them. All the resources the disciples need, money, travel provisions, and extra clothing will be given to them by those who accept their ministry. The disciples are not to profit from the gospel, but their basic needs are to be met. Verse 10b says, "For the worker is worth his keep." They should expect God to meet their needs, without taking undue concern for their own needs. Furthermore, they should expect that God would normally meet their needs through the inspired hospitality of others. Matthew emphasizes the simplicity, austerity, and urgency of the mission. The point of Jesus' strictness is not to leave His disciples deprived and defenseless but dependent on others for their nourishment in every area of life. Verse 11 says, "Whatever town or village you enter, search there for some worthy person and stay at their house until you leave." As they enter each new location, the disciples must look for those who are worthy. Here, worthiness does not imply a moral quality but openness to the message and ministry of the disciples. Such worthiness referred to here is demonstrated by the receptivity shown to the disciples and their message. Stay in a worthy place and don't confuse the message of the gospel by staying with questionable folks. You don't want to stay in a home that is known for dealing illegal drugs, because it will invalidate the credibility of the message. Do whatever you can to maintain the credibility of the message. Stay in a worthy place and stay there until you depart, although this may be humble, very modest. Jesus is saying here, be content and focus on the gospel. Verse 12 says, "As you enter the home, give it your greeting." When they come to a new town and begin preaching, they should offer a friendly greeting and blessing on any home they enter. Be courteous, polite, well-mannered, and agreeable. Introduce yourself, your mission, who sent you. Their approach should be a positive one, offering peace and healing and assuming that people will receive the message. Verse 13 says, "If the home is deserving, let your peace rest on it, if it is not, let your peace return to you." In Jesus' mind, there are only two ways to respond to his message: accept it wholeheartedly or reject it. Since the disciples will preach Jesus' message and use his methods, they should expect exactly the same outcomes. If anyone will not listen, take back the blessing. Don't waste it on them, take it back. Don't give them God's benediction if they're not worthy of it. Don't tell them God will bless them. That was an Oriental expression: they would give their peace, but if the house wasn't worthy, they'd take it back. They would come to a home and say, "Peace be unto you in the name of Christ." If the home was rejecting, they would say, "We take back our peace. This house is unblessed." Verse 14 says, "If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, leave that home or town and shake the dust off your feet." Jesus also prepared the disciples for anticipated rejection. If they were not welcomed, Jesus told them to leave and shake the dust from their feet, a gesture that was triggered by people making the wrong choice not to receive Jesus. The symbolism of shaking the dust off graphically communicates that the disciples are not responsible for other people's choices. While they are permitted to take shelter and food from those who accept them, they are to take nothing from those who reject the message, not even loose dirt from the road. Verse 15 says, "Truly I tell you, it will be more bearable for Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town." Rejecting the disciples' message is seen as a serious sin, indeed, worse even than the gross rebellion of Sodom and Gomorrah in Old Testament times. The increasing culpability of such rejection probably stemmed from the fact that God's revelation in Christ was that much more clear and immediate. Jesus' strategy and attitude for dealing with those who reject his followers and their message is still appropriate for Christians today: do not take judgments into your own hands but leave the fate of those who reject the message of Christ in the hands of God. Our lesson ends with the anticipation that there will be much animosity to the Christian gospel. Key verse. Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. Matthew 10:1. Jesus did not only call the 12. He also gave them power to do what he had called them to do. The same principle holds true today: whom God calls, God equips. The equipping may not be completely evident before the ministry begins, but it will be evident along the way. Thought to remember. The all nations of Matthew 28:19 still await the gospel. It is interesting that this verse doesn't mention any specific technique that we are to use in our pursuit of going to reach all nations. There are many ways to attract the lost to the best news in the whole world, the news that Jesus saves. It's possible for a person to be saved through a gospel tract, a TV program, a personal testimony, or even through music and dance which easily capture the focus of kids. We must be serious about finding a way to bring the good news to the lost. Jesus told us to be on the go, to be constantly in motion, trying to find ways to bring this glorious news to those who are in need. What are you or your church doing to attract people of all ages to the gospel's good news? Are you on the go as Jesus commanded us to be? Our lesson next week is entitled, Called to Remember. Our biblical reference is Matthew 26:1-13. We are truly glad you spent time to learn this week's lesson with us. We hope you are blessed and may share these with somebody else. We wish you can join us at the Cubao Church of Christ soon. Our congregation is a place to discover faith, find new friends, grow closer relationship with Christ and serve with each other's gifts. Thank you very much, have a great week, and God bless you always, dear brothers and sisters.